Welcome, Finxters. Now, if you are into the world of web scraping, then it is extremely important to understand how to rotate and change your IP. Now, let me tell you why. A major challenge faced by web scrapers is being blocked by the web servers. Organizations have introduced technologies like CAPTCHAs to stop bot like behaviors on their web servers. Now, I'm pretty sure that most of you might have come across a CAPTCHA. It's quite frustrating, isn't it? And if you are a web scraper, then it is more frustrating for you. So you must deal with such situations, and it is extremely important as a web scraper to ensure that you do not scrape recklessly using your crawler that reveals a bot-like behavior and eventually you get blocked by the web server. There are numerous ways using which you can achieve this, that is, you can avoid getting blocked by the web server. And one of the most efficient ways is to keep rotating your IP address and change the user agent as frequently as possible when you scrape a certain website. So that's why it is very important to learn how to rotate and change your IP while scraping. Now, what are proxies? A proxy or a proxy server is nothing but an intermediate server that resides between you, that is the client, and the destination server. Simply put, you can think of a proxy server as a gateway between your machine and the web server that you want to scrape. So when you use a proxy server to send a request to the web server, the destination web server actually receives a request from a different IP, which is the IP of the proxy server, and it has no idea about your IP address. Well, this is true in most cases. We have concepts of full proxy, half proxy, but we are not going to dive deep into those things because that is not the point of discussion today. We are going to understand how we can rotate and change the IP. Hence, a proxy server allows you to access another website by hiding your IP, thereby providing you with an added level of security. Now, if you want to learn more about proxies, then I found a very interesting and a quick video on the internet. I'll provide the link to that video, in the description below. You can go and have a look at it, and you will get a very clear overview of what proxies are from that video. But now let's dive into today's discussion and let's learn how we can actually rotate and change the IP. But before we dive into the code, let us try to understand what are the benefits of using proxies while web scraping. You can continue and retry scraping a web page even after the initial IP address has been blocked. That means even if a particular IP address that you were using to scrape the website has been blocked, you can use another IP address by rotating them and still keep scraping the website even though the first IP address was blocked. You get an added level of security as your IP, and thus your location is not revealed. So this means since the proxy hides your actual IP address, hence your location is also hidden. Now there will be contents that are region specific. For example, a content that is accessible in one part of the world might not be accessible in another part. So this is where proxies come in. You can access geo-restricted contents with the help of proxies. Web servers find it very difficult to understand a bot-like behavior if IPs and user agents are frequently rotated. Now, this is because it gets thousands of requests coming from different IPs, so it thinks that the requests have been made by different users. So, if you are making lots of requests to the web server using different IPs, then the web server will not be able to understand that you are a single person or you are using a web scraper to make those requests. Instead, it will think that these are different persons sending requests from different locations. Hence, you will not get blocked. So, these are the benefits of rotating an IP address while you are web scraping. Now it's time to have a look at an example where we will be changing our IP address. So this is a website which returns you your IP address. Hence, this is our IP address at this point of time. Let's have a look how we can fetch this IP address with the help of our requests library. Hence, we first need to import the requests library. So let's go ahead and do that. Now let's go ahead and let's send a GET request to that web page. So rest equals request dot get, and we need the URL. So let's fetch the URL. This is the URL. Okay. We now have the URL. Now let's simply go ahead and let's print the response. So rest dot text. That's it. Now let's check if we have fetched the IP properly or not. And there we go. We have fetched the IP from this web page. So this was the IP and this is what we fetched. But this is our original IP and we want to change it. So how are we going to do that? A simple way of doing that is to pass the proxy within an argument known as proxies of the get method. So get method has an argument known as proxies within which you can pass the proxy and that will help you to change the IP address. Now you might be thinking, where do I get the different IP that will be working for me? For that, we have a free website known as freeproxylist.net. Here you get a list of free proxies. Now please note, most of these proxies will not work for you because these are freely available proxies and millions of users are using them. So by the time you use them, they might already get expired. So it is always suggested to buy a premium proxy and those proxies will definitely work for you. Now we have to find which proxy will work for us from this list. So let's select a random IP. Let's say this one. Let's select this one. And the port is 80. As you can see that the port is 80. So port is 80. Now we need to pass this to our proxies argument. So to do that, I will create a dictionary by the name proxy. And within this, we will pass HTTP, which is the key, and the value is HTTP. And this was IP and the port that we selected. Okay, let's do same thing for HTTPS. Well, that's it. Now we simply need to pass this dictionary to our argument, which is proxies. That's it. Now this was our initial IP. Let's keep a track of that. Okay. Now let's go ahead and now let's try to send this request and we will find what is the IP that is being returned by that website at this point of time. And there we go. Now, as you can see that the request was sent from this IP address instead of our original IP address. So this is how we can use the get method and its proxies argument to change the IP address from which we want to send the get request. Well, I already told you that using free proxies is not recommended as most of the proxies expire and are of no use as most of them are already blocked by the servers. However, if you wish to use a free proxy list, then automating the process of extracting the proxies that work is the best approach. Since free proxies expire soon, you should keep rotating them. Manually creating the list can be extremely frustrating and tedious. Hence, the best way to prune or filter working free proxies is to use a script to find the working proxies and then store them in some place. So let's have a look how we can do that. So I'll help you with a 3-step process to do this. Let's move on to our website, which provides us the proxy list. Now open up this website, click on this get raw list icon, select the entire list and copy it. Now let's store all these IPs in a text file. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's create a text file. Let's name it free underscore proxy.txt. Now within this file, we are going to store the entire list of proxies that we copied. Okay, let's delete this part. We do not need it. Okay, now the list is ready. Now the problem here is most of these proxies will not work while some will work. So let's go ahead and find out which proxies are going to work. So to do that, our next step is to go ahead and create an empty list. Let's say we are going to name that list proxy underscore list. Now what this list will do is that it will store all the proxies that are present in this file. Hence, let's go ahead and let's open the free underscore proxy file. So to do that, we use with open, then the file name, which is free underscore proxy.txt as f. Now let's read each line of this file. That means we will read each proxy one by one. So to do that, we use a for loop for line in f. And now we will go ahead and append each proxy to this list proxy underscore list. So to do that, we are going to use proxy underscore list dot append, and within append we are going to pass line, and let's also use a strip method to eliminate all the white spaces. So this method, what it will do is that it will store all the lines, that is each IP along with its port, as an element within this proxy underscore list. So before we proceed further, let's go ahead and let's print proxy underscore list and let's check if this works or not. And there we go. We have successfully stored all the IPs along with their port within this list. Now comes the most important part. We now have to check if each proxy is active or it is not working. An active proxy will return the status as 200. That is, once it receives a response from the web server, and if it is working, then we will get a status of 200. Therefore, we are going to store all the functional IP addresses that get a response of 200, that is, the status code has to be 200, in another list. So let's do that. So to do that, we are again going to create another list which goes by the name working underscore proxies. And within this, we are going to store our working or active proxies. Now let's iterate over all the proxies that are available. So for I in proxy underscore list. So we are simply iterating over all the proxies that are available. Now we are going to use the try and except blocks in case we get any error so that they can be handled. Now within the try block, we are going to send our request, that is the get request. So let's do that. Requests dot get, and then we need our URL. So to use a URL, what we are going to do is use this URL and check if we send a request to this website, then do we get a proper response? That is a response which has a status code of 200. So let's paste the URL. Now, if you remember, we have to pass proxies within this proxies argument. Now, how do we define the proxies? So to do that, once again, we will go ahead and create a dictionary. Let's name that dictionary as proxy. Within this, we have the keys HTTP, and the second key is HTTPS. Well, now we need to pass the URL. It's going to be HTTP, and then we need to append the value of I to this string. So what this essentially means is that it will look something like this: HTTP and then the IP along with its port. So that's what we are going to pass to this key. We are going to do the same thing for our HTTPS key. So let's do that. Well, that's it. And now we need to pass this dictionary to our argument proxies. So let's pass proxy dictionary to the argument proxies. Okay. Now we will get a response with a status code of 200 only if this works. So that means when we get a response with a status code of 200, then we can store the IP along with its port in our list working underscore proxies. So let's go ahead and let's append the working proxies to this list. To do that, we are going to use the append method and we will simply append I, which is the working proxy. Now, if this does not work, then we will get an exception and we move inside our except block and we are going to do nothing in that case. That is, we will simply pass. That means if a proxy which is given by I is working, then it will get appended to this list working underscore proxies. And if I, that is an IP along with its port, is not working, then we move inside the except block and it is not considered. And then we move on to the next IP along with its port. If that proxy is working, then it will get appended to this list. Otherwise, it will not get appended. So once we are done with it, we can simply go ahead and we can simply print working underscore proxies, which is the list that stores the list of all the working proxies. Or what we can also do is that we can store all these proxies in another file. But in this case, I'm simply printing the proxies to have a look at which proxy is working for me. Since this is a huge list, this is going to take an enormous amount of time. So what I did was I already found out which proxies are working and I selected a few of them, which I'll use again to show you how we can rotate those proxies. So what we can do now is that we can simply go ahead and execute this piece of code and let it run. In the meantime, I'll also explain you how we can actually rotate the working proxies. And once we are done with this program, that is, this program finishes its execution, we can go ahead and have a look at the output, which will show us the proxies that are working. So this is nothing but a simple script that I showed, which you can use to filter out those proxies which are working. Since those are free proxies, so most of them will not work, but the ones that are working will help us to send a GET request and also help us to hide our IP. And we can hide our IP in a way that we can rotate those IPs one by one. So as I said, for the time being, what I'll do is I'll allow this code to run and then I'll go ahead and create a new Python file and I'll name it rotate. And within this, I'm going to copy this piece of code and paste it. And instead of populating the proxy underscore list with proxies from our file, I'll go ahead and simply manually feed in certain proxies. So these are the proxies that I have stored in my list. Now, some of these proxies are already working. So this will help us to save some time and it will also help us to visualize the output. So we have our proxy list, which stores these proxies. Now we will go ahead and find out which of these proxies are working and store them in our list working underscore proxies. And then we will rotate those proxies. So let's go ahead and find out how we can rotate the proxies. Now what we will be doing is we will send 3 requests and find out from which IP that request was sent to the server. So as we did before, we are going to use this URL and let's copy it. Let's keep a track of the URL. Okay. Now let's create a for loop that will help us to send 3 individual requests. So for I in range 3, and now let's send the request. So rest equals requests dot get. And now we need to feed in the URL. So this was the URL. Okay. And now we also need to feed in the value to our proxies argument. Now this is where it gets interesting. We need to send the request from random proxies. So to do that, we have to select a random proxy in each iteration. So let's say that we are going to store a random proxy in this variable, random underscore IP. Now we need the help of a module known as random. So let's go ahead and first let's import random. Once we have imported random, then we can go ahead and use it and then use its choice method to select a random value from our list working underscore proxies. So what this line of code is doing is that it is selecting a random IP along with its port from the list working underscore proxies. And what was working underscore proxies? It was a list that was storing a list of all the proxies which are active. So in every iteration, we are selecting a random proxy from this list. Now we need to go ahead and define our dictionary, which we will pass to this argument proxies. So let's go ahead and define that dictionary as we have been doing so far. Let's simply copy this and let's paste it. And now in this case, this is not going to be I. Rather, this is going to be random underscore IP. So let's go ahead and change it. Okay. And then let's go ahead and pass it to our argument, which is proxies. So let's do that. Okay. Well, that's it. Now we simply need to go ahead and use a print statement wherein we will simply print which request has been received from which IP. So instead of simply printing rest.txt, we are using a print statement so that we can visualize individual requests received from a particular IP. Well, before we execute this piece of code, let us go ahead and let's do something. Let us print IP that is being checked. It's going to be I. Then let's also print the random IP that has been selected. And then let's finally print the output. which denotes the IP which is being used to send the particular request. Let's also print the working IPs. So let's go ahead and do that. So let's print active IPs. Okay. Now let's go ahead and execute this piece of code. So the program has begun its execution. The IPs are being checked if they are working or not. Okay. 3 IPs are already being checked. 3 IPs have already been checked. Okay. The fourth IP is also being checked. Now these are the working IPs. So two of those IPs are working. So this is the random IP that has been selected. So as you can see, the request has been received from the following IP, and it was first sent from this IP, and then it was sent using this IP. And the third request was once again sent using this IP. Since we had only two working IPs, hence the requests were sent using both of them. So this is how we used this code to rotate our IPs. So what we did was we first checked from the list if these IPs are active or not. Then we found that yes, two among those IPs are working. Then we went on to send 3 requests to the server using these IPs, such that we rotated these IPs among them. Now, this is only a small list which has only 4 IPs, and as you found that only two among these IPs are working, hence the rotation was not as effective as we wanted it to be. That is why I mentioned previously that you should always try to use a premium list of IPs. But the purpose is quite clear here, and we successfully rotated the IPs among them. So the first request was sent with the help of this IP, while the second request was sent with the help of this IP. So as you can see that we successfully rotated the IPs. Well, that's it. Well, before we wrap this up, here are a few good practices that you should follow. You should not change or rotate IP addresses after logging in or if you are using a session. It is a bad practice to use IP addresses that fall in the same sequence. This is because anti-scraping tools can easily detect that the requests are coming from a bot if it gets thousands of requests from the same IP sequence. You should always purchase and use premium proxies if you are scraping thousands of pages. And you should rotate IPs along with user agents to avoid detection. Well, that's it. I hope you enjoyed this lecture. If you have any doubts, please mention them in the comments below, and I'll try my best to answer all your queries.